Hello, I'm James Vanatakis, and I'm the Executive Director of the Australian American Fulbright Commission. And welcome to this week's In Conversations with Fulbright. Now, one of the hot topics over the last few years has been the changing power balance in the Pacific, the rise of China, and sort of a more isolationist approach by the United States and America. And this happens almost every day. We see new developments from, China's response to Australia's military exercises to the sort of diplomacy of COVID-19 vaccines. How do we understand that? How do we unpack it? And how is it different to what's happened before, in other historical sort of tensions between superpowers? Now, to unpack this, we're joined by Helen Zhang, and Helen's amazing. She is the co-founder of Intrigue Media, and in 2019 was the Anne Wexler Fulbright Scholar. Helen, welcome. And can we start by talking about your Fulbright scholarship to Harvard?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for having me, James. I was a Fulbright Scholar under the Anne Wexler program, and I studied the Master of Public Administration program at Harvard Kennedy School. Wow. And largely what that means is I think, a lot of people are like, what the hell is an MPA, or what the heck is an MPA? And it's basically, I think, sort of like an MBA, but for public policy. So sort of teaching future leaders how to lead, and sort of the kind of more complex questions about policy and about ethics and all the things that are associated with public leadership in our day and age. So as part of that, I actually focused on geopolitics, as well as, emerging content moderation issues in tech and geotech issues between the US and China and the rest of the world, pertaining to misinformation, disinformation, and a lot of other kind of policies that intersect geopolitics and tech. So that's what I studied. And unfortunately, we didn't get a graduation because of COVID, but I was very, very grateful for the Fulbright experience and the support that the Commission provided when I was there.
Fantastic. I mean, spending that time at Harvard Kennedy School must have been pretty exciting. How was the experience?
Yeah, I think, look, it was, it exceeded expectations. I think I sort of just managed my expectations before going over, because I wasn't sure whether you'd meet sort of genuine people who were very, not about grandstanding, but actually there to learn. And I think that was my criteria and definition for whether it would be a good experience. And I think I definitely met a lot of people from different walks of life. It was a very international cohort. Over 65% people from my program were outside of the US. So I really learned a lot from that mid-career cohort of people who have worked at least 10 years in their field before coming to study. And of course, the best access was sort of, the opportunities you would have to meet all these professors, and learning from professors like Sam Power and Ash Carter and Nicholas Burns, who I think is like now the US ambassador to China, and taking a class with him, and sort of other leaders in their field. So that was really, really exciting.
Fantastic. Now, you're an author. You're one of the authors for the International Intrigue newsletter. I'd love. Can you give us a little bit of background about what the newsletter is and where it came from? Why you produce this newsletter?
Sure.
It's a lot of fun to read for those who aren't into it. Yeah, I love reading it. So yeah, but tell us a little bit about it, because it's a different take on the world of geopolitics, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Well, we try to be, refreshing. That's sort of our whole bent. So it's what we call a media tech startup these days. So my co-founder and I, John Fowler, we were both former diplomats, and he actually joined the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in the same intake as me, and was posted to Shanghai in China, and speaks fluent Mandarin. And so he and I were talking about how, there's so many interesting issues happening around the world in foreign policy, but the way foreign policy is written is so boring. And there's very few publications or content out there that's really touching on how foreign policy has evolved in this day and age, and how it pertains to business, and why it matters to technology, and how these things intersect. So that's what we hope to write about. We hope to write about global affairs issues at the intersection of geopolitics, tech, and business. And what that means is, for example, with this current copper crisis going on in Peru, what does that mean for the rest of the world? It's not just that Peru is in sort of political turmoil. It actually impacts a whole bunch of supply chain issues that then affect the sort of technologies that we have, and then the national security issues that come with it. So that was the sort of driving intent, and we wanted to have some fun along the way. And look, here I'll admit that John is far more funny and witty than I am, and really the brains behind it and the looks actually. So he and I just trying to engage with the next generation of sort of thought leaders and people who are interested in foreign policy but may not be practitioners of foreign policy, but want to understand it to, you know, do better at their jobs or sort of just have a laugh along the way. So we started this journey in September 2020 during while I was in quarantine actually. So it's come a long way, and we're hoping to grow it into Intrigue Media, which I hope to sort of, you know, disrupt the geopolitics and foreign policy media landscape.
Yeah, I mean, what I really found interesting, and I love the way you describe it, is that a lot of the foreign policy analysis, I suppose, as you said, is it's not the most exciting thing to read. For geeks like me, it's fine, but it does have that feeling of looking at the world with a rearview mirror, like, you know, like this is happening, so what can we understand from the past? Whereas, like you said, the global business transactions with tech and with supply chains and all that has changed the makeup of the world, right? So I think one of the things that International Intrigue does do is sort of say, is, you know, pay tribute to what's happened before, but also has that lens about, well, how to understand it in the contemporary context.
Right, exactly, and how to think about future issues, which I think, you know, trends that develop over the course, that used to develop over the course of a decade, now develop over the course of a year or 2 years. So, and especially with COVID, which has just accelerated existing trends. But yeah, we try and sort of, I think, just have the Australian spirit of not being elitist as well, because I do think that a lot of the writing for foreign policy out there is written for an elite audience, and it almost excludes people who might be interested but just might not have the vocabulary or sort of historical context and understanding of these issues. But yeah, thank you, James.
Yeah, no, I do love it. So, talking about contemporary issues, I know one of the areas that obviously comes up is China, and how things are playing out specifically in the Pacific, with being a sort of an area, I suppose, of contestation between China and the US. So maybe can we just spend a few minutes maybe unpacking how you interpret China's current strategy in the Pacific?
In the South China Sea as well as the Pacific. Yeah, I think I would sort of try and, I mean, I know Australia largely lumps it into sort of Indo-Pacific these days, and I think that encompasses obviously like sort of India subcontinent, and then as well as the Oceania region. I would say that there's China's got very different stakes in the three areas. But the most important one being, I think, the South China Sea, where it really sees that area as its backyard, in the same way that the US would see Latin America and South America as its backyard as well. And so I think China sort of has obviously historical claims, or sort of claims that it has had a presence there pre sort of, you know, Ming Dynasty, which is the 1300s, 1400s era of being in that area. And then it had this sort of 9-dash line, which I think has been debunked both by the Southeast Asian countries as well as by the International Court of Arbitration as having no international claims. But I think irrespective of that, China is going to try and assert its military dominance in the South China Sea for the foreseeable future, and that's not going to change because it's of strategic importance to China. I think over sort of 90% of its trade comes through the Malacca Strait. Don't quote me on that. I think that's probably a large portion of China's trade definitely comes through the Malacca Strait, and there's a choke point there where I think a lot of sort of China wants to ensure that it has control and dominance over the sort of freedom of navigation there. But at the same time, of course, Australia and the US are there trying to ensure that international rules are abided by. And so that's where the next kind of tension or flare up in the region will definitely come from. But that said, I think that what a lot of analysis is missing from when they look at sort of China's role and stake in the South China Sea is that China doesn't necessarily want confrontation or a military sort of flare up either. And so that's why it's also looking to alternative sea routes and also overland routes, which is why the Belt and Road Initiative was such an important part of that. Its sort of foreign policy strategy, as well as like developing the sort of Arctic region as well, which is something that's increasingly become a hotter issue, pardon the pun, in the past few years, because as the Arctic sea ice melts, then you'll have more sea traffic being able to go through, and China's now one of the, I think, observer states to the Arctic, even though it's more than 1,000 miles away from the actual area. So China has to put up more of a fight in Oceania in terms of sort of pushing back against traditional US and Australian presence there. And Australia has been a very strong partner to a lot of Oceania countries over the past few decades, but China is sort of slowly moving in and providing aid. And what that buys, I think, and sort of in providing infrastructure as well as part of its Belt and Road Initiative. And what that provides, I think, is sort of the Oceania states votes in multilateral organizations such as the United Nations, where every state, even though if you're a tiny state, you still get one vote in the UN, which matters. And that helps, China to then garner votes that can be favorable towards its decisions. And that's very clever, diplomacy by China. But how far they can succeed there in sort of the long term, it will depend on how much the US and Australia does to counter that and to push back. And so I think what we've seen with the Australian government in recent years is sort of stepping up its presence in Oceania in order to kind of resist and push back a little on the Chinese influence there, because the sort of same string of criticisms that have followed China around its other Belt and Road Initiative projects have also come to the Pacific, where they bring in Chinese workers, they don't contribute to the economy, and there's a bit of a debt trap question of how it all works out in the long term and comes out in the wash. So so I think you're going to see sort of China, you're not going to see China decrease its presence in any of the three areas, in the Indian Ocean, in the South China Sea, and also in Oceania. But you can't, it's sort of real politics, right? That is their backyard, and that is what I think Chinese government would argue any superpower sort of claiming its rightful sort of claim to, status, not claim, but rightful sort of sphere of influence. Yeah.
So maybe if we can move on, talk a little bit about current Australian and Chinese diplomatic relations. There seems to have been obviously quite a few tensions there. So maybe we can again, it's a multi-dimensional relationship. There's obviously not just about one thing, but how would you describe sort of the current relationship between Australia and China in sort of those sort of broad diplomatic terms, I suppose, or understanding?
I think the word frosty gets thrown around a lot. I think this is particularly within diplomatic cables, you see this term frosty. And I think even in sort of the kind of commentary that you see in the media these days. But I have seen a lot more sharper words than even frosty, which is sort of, Australia's kind of being accused of bordering on McCarthyism and this feeling of general kind of antagonism towards China. And look, I don't know from which point the bilateral relationship exactly broke down, but, I reflect on 2021 this year being the 10-year anniversary from when I was based in China, working as a locally engaged staff at the Australian embassy there in Beijing in 2011. And the sort of the vibes, want of a better word, of that time between the bilateral relationship was very, very different, because we had a very strong trade relationship that was built on trust, or at least sort of as much trust and cooperation as possible. An overall sort of acceptable political relationship and very strong cultural and people-to-people ties. Now, if you look at it through those three prisms 10 years on, the trade relationship's gone sort of bottoms out a little bit. Political relationship has gone a lot more hardline, and that sort of accelerated under the Trump years with the US. And I think culturally, the people-to-people ties in Australia has really fallen out too, because you've seen both China weaponizing the Chinese diaspora in Australia, as well as sort of both sides actually, Australians and Chinese, sort of turning on the goodwill that was built over the last few decades. So it's not sort of to the point of, I think, no return. I think that there's definitely an understanding that there's a mutual need for each other. Australia still provides a lot of the crucial minerals and resources that China needs, but I think both countries are looking to diversify their reliance on sort of the exports that have been produced by both sides, as well as, I think, finding new ways and creative ways to sort of, restart bilateral dialogues or sort of some kind of people-to-people relationship at the business level, at the government level, and at the individual level.
Yeah, I mean, it has been fascinating, from an Australian cultural perspective to see, like you said, the people-to-people discussion sort of really become frosty as well. That kind of cultural exchange also seems really, and I think there has been, and I think unfortunately, a lot of Chinese Australians on a sort of everyday level of experience, have experienced some of the backlash related to be it related to the history of the coronavirus and its source and the relationship with China and so on. So I think that and that's played out in really interesting, obviously really disturbing ways with the experience of racism, which I think is inexcusable, but it's also played out in really fascinating ways in the media by talking about quote unquote war with China. And we've seen a number of commentators openly talk about war with China. I mean, it seems like a pretty bizarre thing to be talking about. Can you have any idea about why such conversations are taking place, by some pretty high profile sort of defense analysts and China analysts in Australian media?
Yeah, I think sort of there are definitely personalities within the current Australian administration who I think are probably a little bit more blunt about the way they talk about these issues than say their predecessors, and that comes from sort of either their military backgrounds or their I think their intent to send a message to China. And I think part of it has come from, you've got to look at the context in which this conversation or this sort of language emerged from, which was during the Trump years, where I think a lot of Australian or just Western allies of the US felt abandoned. And I think talks in Australia of sort of war with China seemed as probable as they could have been in any other time, given the sort of pullback from the US, the more assertive Chinese behavior in the sort of Indo-Pacific region, and Australia's probably most adversarial stance towards China than in the last 30 to 40 years. So that sort of combination of factors, I think, has kind of given rise to maybe like one buzzword being picked up by a sort of one interview, and then that sort of going viral and getting picked up by just sort of the general social media and the 24-hour news cycle these days. But I do think it is dangerous because it rings alarm bells in other sort of Western capitals, and including in the US, where I think I've seen this being captured in CNN on the news, asking why Australian officials are sort of using this word. And it sends signals to China. And I think that in some ways it sort of made both sides kind of sit up and take notice of how to avoid that and how to sort of manage any sort of escalating military conflict that could be on the horizon. But it just, it does show that diplomacy still, relies very much on words and sort of wordsmithing and and being careful about what's said and what's not said.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it created a lot of angst amongst a lot of the population here in Australia about why such words were being openly used by some people within the administration, but also some commentators. So I mean, what would be, I mean, if you happen to be the main advisor, what would be your advice on de-escalation? How would you like to see de-escalation happen?
Do you mean Australia's de-escalation with China?
With China, yeah.
I mean, that's a really hard one, because what China's strategy is it often divides and conquers, and it prefers to have bilateral dialogue rather than multilateral dialogue. And unfortunately, it's succeeded in that in the last 4 years, and Australia sort of lost out on a bit of that because we've lost, the US just hasn't been present in any of the sort of main multilateral mechanisms in the region, like, for example, in RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the US hasn't been at the table. I mean, they pulled out, so it was a bit of an own goal. And so lacking sort of that kind of big multilateral backing, it's been harder for Australia to sort of drive its agenda with China in multilateral forums. But I think that needs to continue, and I think that Australia still needs to ensure that it holds China accountable in multilateral forums while continuing the bilateral dialogue and sort of kickstarting the bilateral sort of cooperation again where possible. I know that there are a few things are on hold at the moment, but it takes sort of, strong bureaucrats being in both capitals as well, and sort of restarting the business relationship, as well as restarting the people-to-people ties, and that means tourism, which at the moment is just very difficult, as well as education, again, because of COVID, very difficult. So I think that Australian, if I was a main advisor, I would probably advocate for direct dialogue between President Xi Jinping and Scott Morrison, and see where we can find new areas of cooperation. But I think Australia at the moment is very inward looking because of COVID and because of what we're dealing with at home. But it needs to sort of think about the next 2 to 3 years rather than kind of the next election cycle.
Fantastic. Well, actually, we might just leave it at that. I think that's a really interesting point to leave it. Is there anything else you want to add, or anything else that you think we've missed that's really important? Or
I would just want to say one thing about the Cold War, because I know that you'd flag that as a that, is talked about a lot, especially in the US. And I think I would just kind of caveat that and sort of warn against sort of using that framework for analyzing the US-China relationship, because comparisons of China to the former USSR is very dangerous in that it basically underestimates how complex the US-China relationships compared to the former USSR and the US. China is much more sophisticated as a country, obviously, much more economically powerful, and it has, I think, sort of, if you looked at the Eurasia Group produced a report, I think in the last couple of weeks, where it showed it charted the amount of world leaders who went to visit China as their first place of visit versus the US. And this is, during Trump years as well as Biden years. And it's not even comparable. So China has sort of increasingly expanded its reach and diplomatic sort of network around the world with developing countries, while the US has been withdrawing. And so to kind of frame China as a simplistic former USSR sort of adversary to the US, I think can be very dangerous, because it fundamentally sort of creates a policy bias where you think, oh, we've dealt with this before, so therefore we should be able to deal with this again. But it's a very different challenge, and I think that those in the US should really reframe their thinking and recalibrate that. But unfortunately, I still see this being thrown around all the time, even in sort of, progressive circles and places that are focused on the NATO alliance. So,
I mean, that actually loops us really nicely back to your International Intrigue newsletter, right? Because one of the things that's really powerful about it, as I said, is that it doesn't look at the world through that old lens, right? And and that's a risk of the Cold War, right? You've got this sort of vision of a homogenized bad guy sitting there, and then you've got the rest of freedom and everyone wanting to break away.
Yes.
But it is a radically different context, isn't it?
Absolutely. Radically different context, very different ideologies as well, and very different motives, intents, and capabilities. And so when you've got that combination, and how integrated the Chinese economy is to the world economy, and just how integrated the world economy is, period, to deal with sort of a challenger like China to the US sort of world supremacy or hegemony is a much more complex problem. But the thing is, like, human beings hate complex problems. So we often default to what's simple and what's able to sort of be boxed into this neat little package of like, okay, this is kind of like the Cold War, we'll deal with it that way.
Yeah.
So, we'll see. I think Australia is actually very far ahead in our understanding of, how to deal with the China sort of situation compared to the US in many ways. And I really do think that further collaboration between the US and Australia can benefit both countries. And we'll see what happens.
So, Helen, if we can now turn to one final question, which is Taiwan. And let's face it, Taiwan is the sort of like the geopolitical elephant in the room. It's we all know it's happening, and for decades no one talked about it, but it's now front and center, and it's on the the front page of the news. So maybe we can just talk about begin by talking about, what do you think China's intent is with Taiwan?
I think the intent of China vis-a-vis Taiwan has never really shifted. It's always been sort of one China.
One China.
It's not and I think that's something that's been repeated over the last 20 years, but it's just now much more vocal and much more sort of definitive. And because China's stakes in the world have risen, and they're in a much more powerful position to be able to assert their strategic goals and come out and say it. And we've seen what happened with Hong Kong, which was that they had intended to keep it one country, two systems until 2037. And what we saw happen there last year indicated that China is bold enough to move irrespective of what the international community thinks. And even though Taiwan is will be a lot more difficult to sort of assert mainland, well, actually invade. That's what it would be. I wouldn't put it off the table for China to do this, irrespective of international condemnation. Now, your question of what the US would do is much more complex, because of course the US would step in and defend Taiwan, as it's sort of obligated to do. But what Australia then does will be very tricky, because then I think we would have to, the ANZUS Treaty would be invoked, and we would have to step in too. And what that looks like is, a big fat mess, I think, for want of a better word. But I think we're still, a few years away from that. I think China still knows that Taiwan is sort of a very clear red line for the US and the international community. And that the Taiwanese people have very clearly voted that they don't want to be part of China. So what China is probably going to be doing is internal sort of meddling with Taiwanese politics, which it does very well, and slowly turning the sentiments of the Taiwanese people to be more favorable towards China. And so that project's going to take a little bit of time, and we'll see what happens there militarily.
Yeah, wow. Well, which then brings us back to the whole, one of your, I think, really important early points, that diplomacy matters, right? And that's one of the things that I think has driven your work, and obviously it drives your work around international intrigue and your research and your Fulbright. So thank you so much for your time. It's just been absolutely fantastic to chat to you today. So many great insights. And if you don't subscribe to International Intrigue, get onto it straight away and get the insights. And thank you. I really enjoyed our chat.
Thank you so much, James. And thank you for having me here. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.